The world that gives rise to Supergirl appears, at first glance, orderly and already resolved. Its moral center seems occupied. Its symbols are established. Its heroes are named. Light has a reference point, and hope already has a face. The architecture of this universe does not wait to be discovered. It is inherited. Its skyline is dominated by a figure whose presence defines gravity itself, bending narrative space around him. Everything meaningful already has a place, and that place is taken. Within this environment, identity does not emerge through exploration but through comparison. Meaning is measured by proximity to an ideal that precedes experience. The rules of belonging are implicit, never stated aloud, yet universally understood. To matter is to align. To be seen is to echo. The system does not announce exclusion. It simply rewards resonance with what is already sanctified. Those who arrive later step onto a stage where applause has long been rehearsed. Supergirl enters this terrain not as a blank slate, but as a remainder. She carries the weight of a world that no longer exists, compressed into memory and obligation. Krypton is not a past that can be revisited. It is a pressure that never dissipates. Its loss is not mourned openly because survival demands function. She becomes a vessel for continuity, expected to preserve what was lost while adapting to what replaced it. The contradiction is immediate and structural. Her arrival is not framed as a beginning, but as an addition. She does not introduce a new axis of meaning. She reinforces an existing one. The story does not ask what she might become. It asks how well she fits. The narrative environment treats her presence as supplementary, an extension of a symbol already complete. Her power does not disturb the hierarchy. It confirms it. From the outside, the symmetry looks reassuring. Two figures, the same source of strength, shared values, shared mission, a lineage that appears unbroken. Yet beneath this visual coherence lies a fracture that cannot be resolved through alignment alone. Supergirl does not share Superman's origin story in the way that matters most. She remembers Krypton. She carries its textures, its gravity, its unspoken codes. He represents a myth of integration. She embodies the residue of exile. This difference is rarely spoken aloud, but it governs everything. Superman belongs to Earth because he was shaped by it. Supergirl survives Earth because she has nowhere else to go. One moves toward purpose. The other moves away from loss. In a system that rewards forward momentum, grief becomes invisible. Adaptation is praised. Memory becomes a liability. The cultural climate surrounding her reinforces this imbalance. Audiences recognize her through association before they recognize her as an individual force. Her image is refracted through a familiar lens. The spotlight that illuminates her also casts a shadow, and that shadow has a name. Every act of heroism becomes comparative by default. Every failure echoes louder. The arena is not neutral ground. Supergirl does not struggle because she lacks power. She struggles because power alone does not grant authorship. Her strength places her within a structure that already defines what strength should look like. The moral vocabulary available to her is borrowed. The expectations are preloaded. Even rebellion risks reinforcing the same frame it tries to escape. This is the quiet tension that underlies her narrative presence. It is not a clash of values, but a collision of temporalities. Superman represents arrival. Supergirl represents displacement. One stands at the center of the city. The other navigates its edges, even when she occupies the same physical space. Belonging is not distributed evenly. It is calibrated by origin and timing. The system does not need to actively suppress her to limit her. It only needs to remain stable. Stability itself becomes the barrier. The mythology is already complete. There is no vacant throne, no open frontier. The empire has been founded. What remains is maintenance. Supergirl's identity forms under this pressure. Not through rebellion at first, but through adaptation. She learns the language. She adopts the posture. She performs competence within the boundaries she did not choose. Her presence reassures the public that continuity is intact. The loss of Krypton is symbolically redeemed through her service to Earth. Her grief becomes useful, yet something resists. It does not announce itself as defiance. It surfaces as friction, a hesitation before conformity, a sense that alignment carries a cost that cannot be fully named. The more she embodies the ideal, the more something recedes from view. The shadow grows longer as the light intensifies. This is not the shadow of villainy or corruption. It is the shadow of unrealized selfhood, the parts of her that do not translate cleanly into the dominant myth, the memories that do not serve the narrative of hope, the anger that cannot be publicly justified, the longing for a center that no longer exists. In this world, identity is not forged through isolation but through exposure. Visibility amplifies pressure. Every gesture is read. Every choice is interpreted as confirmation or deviation. Supergirl does not get to fail quietly. Her missteps do not belong to her alone. They ripple outward, reinforcing doubts about whether she can ever fully occupy the role she was never meant to inherit. The opening tension of her story is therefore not conflict but imbalance, a weight placed unevenly across a structure that appears symmetrical. The narrative insists on sameness while the psyche insists on difference. This contradiction does not explode. It accumulates. Supergirl stands beneath a familiar symbol, illuminated by reflected light. The city looks the same. The values sound familiar. The mission remains intact. But beneath the surface, pressure builds. The foundation holds for now. The fracture has not widened. It has only been acknowledged by the system that created it. This is where her story truly begins. Not with a battle, but with a question that has no sanctioned answer. What becomes of identity when it is built inside someone else's shadow? Supergirl's psychological architecture begins in rupture rather than discovery. Her sense of self is formed not through gradual alignment with a world, but through the sudden disappearance of one. Krypton is not an abstract origin myth for her. It is a lived environment that vanished while she was still inside it. This distinction shapes everything that follows. She does not carry a symbol of loss. She carries a memory of continuity that was violently interrupted. Her early formation is marked by a double displacement. She is displaced from her home world, and then displaced again within the narrative world she enters. Earth is not neutral ground. It is already claimed by a myth that precedes her arrival. Superman's story has stabilized the moral geometry of this universe. His presence has defined what strength looks like, what goodness sounds like, what sacrifice means when translated into public language. Supergirl does not arrive to explore these values. She arrives to conform to them. This asymmetry creates a foundational tension between memory and expectation. Superman's identity is constructed through integration. He grows into the role of protector because Earth is where his sense of belonging was shaped. His morality is internalized through experience. Supergirl's morality is imported. She carries the ethical codes of a lost civilization and is then expected to harmonize them with a culture that treats those codes as historical curiosities at best. Krypton functions as a psychological pressure rather than a guiding framework. It is too present to be myth, yet too absent to be lived. Supergirl remembers a world that no longer exists, but she cannot act from within its logic without appearing obsolete or dangerous. Her memories become internalized terrain, inaccessible to the collective gaze. What cannot be shared cannot be validated. What cannot be validated begins to fracture identity from within. The narrative positions her as a bridge between worlds, but bridges do not belong to either side. They are designed for passage, not dwelling. Supergirl is expected to translate Krypton into something Earth can understand, while simultaneously suppressing the parts of Krypton that resist translation. The cost of this mediation is rarely acknowledged. It manifests instead as emotional compression, a constant recalibration of self in response to external norms. Her power intensifies this dilemma. Strength magnifies visibility. Visibility amplifies expectation. Unlike other displaced figures in fiction, Supergirl cannot disappear into anonymity. Her presence triggers immediate symbolic associations. She is read before she speaks. Her actions are interpreted through a template that was never designed for her interiority. The public does not ask who she is. It asks how closely she resembles what it already reveres. This produces a subtle but persistent erosion of authorship. Supergirl's choices are framed as correct or incorrect based on their alignment with an external ideal. Moral evaluation becomes comparative rather than contextual. Even when she succeeds, the success is rarely hers alone. It is absorbed into the larger mythos as confirmation that the system works. Her individuality dissolves into continuity. The psychological effect of this dynamic is not rebellion but fragmentation. Supergirl is not positioned as a challenger to the dominant order. She is positioned as its proof. The system relies on her to demonstrate that its values are universal, adaptable, and resilient. Her struggle must therefore remain legible within existing moral language. Anything that exceeds that language risks destabilizing the narrative. Her relationship to Superman embodies this contradiction. On the surface, it is defined by care, guidance, and shared purpose. Beneath that surface lies an unavoidable symbolic hierarchy. Superman represents the center. Supergirl orbits that center. His authority is not imposed. It is structural. He does not need to assert dominance for the imbalance to persist. The system itself enforces it. This creates a peculiar form of dependency that does not feel like dependence. Supergirl is capable, powerful, and autonomous in action. Yet her sense of legitimacy is tethered to recognition from a figure who embodies the dominant myth. Approval functions as gravity. It stabilizes her trajectory, but it also limits deviation. To move too far from that center risks losing coherence in the eyes of the world. The narrative rarely allows her to occupy moral ambiguity without consequence. Anger is treated as volatility. Doubt is framed as weakness. Grief is acceptable only when quickly transmuted into service. The emotional spectrum available to her is narrow, not because she lacks depth, but because the system cannot accommodate complexity without threatening its own clarity. This compression produces shadow content, not in the form of hidden villainy, but in suppressed effect. Rage without outlet, nostalgia without object, loyalty without reciprocity. These elements do not disappear. They accumulate beneath the surface, shaping decisions in indirect ways. When Supergirl acts impulsively or resists authority, these moments are often framed as lapses rather than signals. The system treats symptoms while ignoring causes. Her internal conflict is therefore not between good and evil, but between continuity and selfhood. To fully integrate into Earth's heroic framework requires relinquishing parts of herself that cannot be reconciled with its mythology. To preserve those parts risks perpetual marginalization. This is not a dilemma that can be resolved through choice alone. It is embedded in the structure of the narrative world. The audience, too, is implicated in this dynamic. Recognition is conditioned by familiarity. Supergirl is often received as an extension rather than an origin. Her story is read through inherited expectations. When she diverges, the divergence feels disruptive. When she conforms, it feels redundant. This oscillation reinforces the sense that there is no stable position from which she can define herself on her own terms. The foundations of her narrative are thus built on displacement layered atop displacement. A lost home, an inherited role, a borrowed moral language, an audience trained to compare rather than encounter. These forces do not collide immediately. They coexist, generating low-level tension that permeates every interaction. Supergirl's identity does not fracture because she fails to adapt. It fractures because adaptation itself becomes endless. There is no final point of arrival, no moment where belonging feels complete. The center remains occupied. The periphery remains crowded. The system continues to function, and within that functioning, something essential remains unresolved. This unresolved core is what drives the narrative forward, not a desire for power, but a need for authorship. Not a rejection of legacy, but a demand to exist beyond it. The foundations are set. The tension is established. What follows is not a sudden rupture, but a gradual polarization as these forces begin to demand incompatible outcomes. The first visible shift in Supergirl's narrative occurs not through open conflict, but through accumulation. Small moments begin to register as weight rather than noise. Decisions that once felt provisional start to feel binding. The system that previously appeared flexible reveals its limits, not through prohibition, but through pattern. Each choice she makes is absorbed, categorized, and reflected back to her as evidence of what she is allowed to be. Her early actions are framed as tests. Not explicitly, but structurally. The world watches to see whether she will replicate an established form of heroism or introduce variation. The framing matters. Replication reassures. Variation unsettles. When she succeeds by mirroring existing norms, the response is swift and affirming. When she deviates, even slightly, the response becomes corrective. The correction is subtle. A look, a warning, a recalibration of trust. These moments accumulate into an internal map. Supergirl begins to sense where the invisible walls stand. She learns which instincts are welcomed and which require restraint. This learning does not occur through failure alone. It occurs through success that feels incomplete, victories that do not translate into ownership, applause that fades quickly, leaving behind an expectation to repeat the performance rather than expand it. The narrative presents this phase as growth, but psychologically it functions as narrowing. Supergirl's range of motion decreases as her competence increases. Mastery comes at the cost of spontaneity. The more reliable she becomes, the more predictable she is expected to be. Reliability turns into a role. The role begins to dictate behavior before conscious intention can intervene. This is where the first internal fracture deepens. Supergirl recognizes that the identity available to her is functional, but not expressive. It allows her to act, but not to define. Her power is operational, not symbolic. She can save lives, but she cannot reshape meaning. The center of the narrative remains occupied by someone else's story, and her actions are read as footnotes to that story rather than chapters of her own. Moments of resistance emerge here, not as rebellion, but as friction. A hesitation before obeying an order. An emotional response that exceeds protocol. A decision made too quickly or too personally. These moments are not catastrophic. They are human. Yet within this system, they are treated as instability. The narrative responds by tightening boundaries. Authority becomes more visible at this stage. Guidance shifts into supervision. Trust becomes conditional. Supergirl is no longer simply learning. She is being managed. This management is framed as protection, both for her and for the world. The implication is clear. Her difference carries risk. Her memory of another world introduces variables that cannot be fully controlled. The symbolic geography of her story begins to shift. She moves closer to the center in visibility, but remains distant in legitimacy. She occupies prominent spaces, yet feels peripheral within them. The city becomes a stage where she performs competence under constant illumination. The spotlight sharpens. The shadow lengthens. Her relationship with Superman evolves in this phase, though not dramatically. The shift is structural rather than emotional. He remains supportive, but his position as reference point becomes more pronounced. His judgments, even when gentle, carry finality. His approval stabilizes her standing. His concern signals potential withdrawal of trust. This dynamic does not require explicit enforcement. It operates through implication. Supergirl begins to internalize this hierarchy. She anticipates expectations before they are voiced. She adjusts herself preemptively. This self-regulation feels responsible. It is praised as maturity, yet it marks a turning point. The center of decision-making moves outward. Identity becomes reactive. The audience perceives this shift as tension, not because the stakes have escalated, but because coherence begins to strain. Supergirl's actions occasionally contradict the image she is expected to maintain. These contradictions are framed as mistakes, even when they arise from ethical clarity or emotional honesty. The narrative does not yet punish her harshly, but it signals that deviation has consequences. This stage establishes the logic of polarization. Supergirl cannot remain indefinitely within a structure that demands both authenticity and conformity without cost. The system offers conditional inclusion. She can belong, but only if she compresses herself to fit. The pressure increases gradually, invisibly, like gravity strengthening as altitude decreases. Her internal world responds accordingly. The suppressed elements intensify. Anger sharpens. Nostalgia hardens into longing. Loyalty becomes complicated by resentment. None of these emotions are allowed clear expression. They circulate beneath the surface, influencing judgment in indirect ways. The more she tries to remain aligned, the more dissonance accumulates. By the end of this movement, the conflict has taken shape, not as a battle between characters, but as a structural incompatibility between selfhood and system. Supergirl stands at a crossroads that does not announce itself. There is no dramatic declaration, no rupture yet. Only a growing awareness that the role she is inhabiting cannot contain the totality of who she is. The narrative continues forward, propelled by this imbalance. The foundation holds, but the stress lines are visible. What comes next is not escalation through spectacle, but through choice. The system will demand clarity. Neutrality will become untenable. The forces in motion cannot be reconciled without transformation. The second movement begins when containment stops working. The strategies that once allowed Supergirl to function within the system lose their effectiveness, not because she abandons them, but because the system itself begins to demand more explicit alignment. Ambiguity, once tolerated as growth, is now framed as risk. The environment tightens, and with it, the margin for internal contradiction narrows. External pressures intensify in ways that feel procedural rather than hostile. Missions carry clearer parameters. Oversight becomes normalized. Decisions are no longer evaluated solely by outcome, but by consistency with an established moral posture. The narrative stops asking whether Supergirl is capable. It asks whether she is predictable. Predictability becomes synonymous with trust. This shift alters how her actions are interpreted. When she hesitates, it is no longer read as thoughtfulness. It is read as doubt. When she reacts emotionally, it is no longer framed as empathy. It is framed as volatility. The language surrounding her presence changes subtly, but decisively. Words like potential and promise give way to caution and concern. The system does not accuse. It diagnoses. Supergirl becomes increasingly aware that her interior life is now under scrutiny, even when it remains unspoken. The pressure is not to behave correctly, but to feel correctly. Emotional alignment becomes as important as strategic alignment. This demand exposes a fundamental impossibility. Her emotional reality cannot be fully harmonized with a world that never experienced the loss she carries. The expectation itself becomes an act of erasure. Her connection to Krypton resurfaces here with renewed force. Not as nostalgia, but as ethical friction. Situations arise that require judgment beyond procedural logic. Moments where her memory of another world informs her sense of responsibility. These moments place her at odds with established authority, not because she rejects its values, but because she perceives consequences others do not. The system reads this as deviation. She experiences it as clarity. This is where polarization accelerates. Supergirl is no longer simply navigating expectations. She is being positioned. Each decision places her closer to one interpretive pole or another, loyal or unstable, disciplined or reckless, integrated or compromised. The space between these categories shrinks rapidly. Nuance becomes suspect. Her relationship with Superman reaches a critical inflection point in this movement. The bond remains intact, but the symbolic weight it carries increases. His role shifts from guide to measure. His perspective becomes the standard against which hers is assessed. Disagreement no longer feels like dialogue. It feels like divergence from the center. This divergence is not fueled by rivalry in the conventional sense. It is fueled by asymmetry of legitimacy. Superman can question the system without threatening it. Supergirl cannot. His authority absorbs contradiction. Hers amplifies it. When she challenges decisions, the challenge reflects back on her identity rather than the structure she critiques. The narrative presents this as a matter of trust, but trust here functions as containment. To be trusted is to remain within acceptable parameters. To question those parameters is to forfeit that trust. Supergirl recognizes this dynamic even as she resists its implications. She begins to understand that obedience is not about safety, but about narrative stability. As polarization deepens, the suppressed elements of her psyche begin to surface more directly. Anger finds expression through urgency. Grief manifests as impatience. Loyalty fractures into conditional compliance. These expressions are not uncontrolled. They are precise. But precision does not protect her from interpretation. The system reads intensity as instability regardless of intent. Public perception mirrors this shift. The audience within the narrative begins to see her through a new lens. Admiration becomes cautious fascination. Media narratives frame her actions as unpredictable. The spotlight that once celebrated her now interrogates her. Visibility transforms into exposure. Every action becomes a data point in a story she does not control. This exposure amplifies internal conflict. Supergirl becomes acutely aware that she is no longer judged solely by what she does, but by what she represents. She embodies a question the system would rather not ask. Can power exist without reproducing the same moral architecture? Can legacy accommodate difference without neutralizing it? Her attempts to assert autonomy become more explicit in this phase, not through grand declarations, but through refusal to simplify her judgment. She resists framing complex situations in binary terms. She refuses to reduce lived experience to procedural logic. These refusals carry consequences. Access is limited. Authority is reasserted. The walls she once sensed now stand visible. The narrative begins to close around her. Options narrow. Choices acquire disproportionate weight. The system positions her as a problem to be managed rather than a perspective to be integrated. This shift marks a decisive break. Supergirl is no longer operating within a flexible structure. She is confronting its boundaries directly. The audience feels this tightening as escalation. Stakes rise not through spectacle, but through inevitability. The conflict can no longer remain internal. The pressure demands resolution. Supergirl cannot return to passive alignment without betraying her own coherence. The system cannot accommodate her difference without destabilizing its center. By the end of this movement, polarization is complete. The narrative has organized itself into opposing forces that cannot be reconciled through compromise. Supergirl stands fully visible, no longer buffered by ambiguity. Her identity is no longer supplementary. It is disruptive. What follows is consequence. Not punishment in the conventional sense, but transformation. The system will respond. The response will redefine roles, meanings, and limits. The fracture will widen, and whatever emerges from that widening will alter the symbolic landscape permanently. The third movement unfolds when the system can no longer interpret Supergirl's presence as temporary disturbance. What once appeared as deviation now registers as structural threat. The narrative environment responds accordingly, not through spectacle, but through redefinition. Roles are clarified. Boundaries are enforced. The question shifts from whether Supergirl fits to whether she can be allowed to remain unchanged. Authority consolidates itself around stability. Decisions become centralized. Risk is framed as something that must be neutralized rather than understood. In this climate, Supergirl's insistence on contextual judgment is no longer read as moral seriousness. It is framed as refusal to comply. The distinction matters. Refusal implies agency. Agency implies authorship. Authorship challenges the center. Supergirl is placed into situations designed to test compliance rather than competence. These are not traps, but calibrations. The outcomes matter less than the posture she adopts while pursuing them. Obedience becomes the metric. Her capacity to internalize external judgment becomes the proof of her readiness. This demand exposes the core contradiction of her role. She is powerful enough to act independently, but not legitimate enough to define the terms of action. The symbolic geography tightens further. Spaces that once felt shared now feel conditional. Access is granted selectively. Information is filtered. The city becomes segmented into zones of permission and zones of exclusion. Supergirl moves through these spaces with increasing awareness of her provisional status. She is present but never fully inside. This spatial shift mirrors her psychological state. The internal split that once operated quietly now asserts itself openly. Parts of her identity that were previously suppressed demand recognition. Her memory of Krypton ceases to function as background pressure and begins to inform her decisions directly. Not as nostalgia, but as ethical orientation. She recognizes patterns of control that echo the structures that failed her home world. The resonance is impossible to ignore. Her relationship with Superman reaches its most strained configuration in this phase. The care remains, but the symmetry is gone. His position requires him to defend the system, even when he recognizes its limitations. Her position requires her to challenge it, even when she understands the risks. This is not a clash of intentions, but of functions. Each represents a different necessity within the narrative order. Their exchanges grow sparse and charged. Silence replaces reassurance. Agreement becomes rare. When they do align, the alignment feels strategic rather than organic. The bond that once offered grounding now reflects the broader fracture. Supergirl realizes that proximity to the center no longer offers protection. It only amplifies scrutiny. Public perception hardens alongside institutional response. The narrative surrounding Supergirl shifts decisively. She is no longer framed as a hopeful addition. She becomes a contested symbol. Support polarizes. Admiration coexists with suspicion. The audience within the story begins to project collective anxieties onto her figure. She becomes a screen for unresolved fears about power without containment. This projection intensifies the pressure she experiences. Every action is interpreted as confirmation of a narrative already forming. Restraint is seen as manipulation. Decisiveness is seen as aggression. Silence is seen as concealment. The interpretive field closes. There is no neutral ground left. At this point, Supergirl faces a choice that is not presented as such. The system offers a path of reintegration through submission. Compliance promises stability, restored trust, and symbolic safety. The alternative is isolation, marginalization, potential exile from the center of meaning. Neither option resolves the internal conflict. One dissolves it, the other preserves it at great cost. Supergirl does not choose rebellion in a dramatic sense. She chooses coherence. She acts in alignment with her own integrated judgment, fully aware of the consequences. This decision is not impulsive. It is the result of accumulated pressure and clarity. She accepts that belonging within this system requires a level of self-erasure she cannot sustain. The immediate consequences are swift. Authority responds by reasserting boundaries. Access is revoked. Trust is withdrawn. Supergirl is repositioned within the narrative as an unstable element. This repositioning does not require physical removal. Symbolic displacement is sufficient. She is no longer treated as central to the story's future. This displacement alters the narrative landscape. The system stabilizes, but at a cost that is not immediately visible. A perspective has been excluded. Attention has been suppressed rather than resolved. The center remains intact, but less adaptable. The structure grows more rigid as a result. For Supergirl, the transformation is profound. She emerges from this phase with a clearer sense of self, but without institutional validation. Her identity is no longer defined by proximity to an existing myth. It is defined by refusal to be absorbed by it. This clarity does not bring peace. It brings distance. The audience witnesses this outcome as loss and necessity intertwined. Supergirl has not failed. She has been rendered incompatible. The system has chosen stability over expansion. The fracture has been sealed, but the pressure remains. This concludes the core development of the conflict. The forces have polarized. The consequences are established. What follows is not further escalation, but reflection. The narrative now turns outward, examining how this conflict reshapes the cultural and symbolic environment beyond the individual figure. Once Supergirl's conflict moves beyond the internal mechanics of the narrative and into the shared symbolic space of the world she inhabits, its significance shifts. What was once a localized fracture becomes a cultural signal. The system responds not only by adjusting roles, but by reorganizing meaning. The conflict ceases to belong solely to Supergirl. It becomes a story the culture tells itself about power, legitimacy, and difference. Within the fictional world, Supergirl's displacement reverberates outward. Institutions recalibrate their language. Media narratives sharpen their frames. Public discourse reorganizes itself around simplified positions that promise clarity where complexity once lived. The conflict is no longer interpreted as a structural tension, but as a personal deviation. This reframing is not accidental. It preserves the stability of the system by relocating responsibility away from its architecture and onto an individual figure. Supergirl becomes a contested symbol precisely because she refuses to resolve into a single narrative function. She is neither villain nor failure. She is not a tragic sacrifice nor a cautionary tale that neatly reinforces existing values. Her ambiguity unsettles the cultural appetite for coherence. As a result, competing interpretations emerge, each attempting to domesticate her meaning in different ways. For some, she represents excess, too much power without sufficient restraint, too much emotion without adequate discipline. This reading frames her displacement as necessary containment. For others, she represents truth, a figure who exposes the cost of inherited moral authority and the violence of enforced harmony. In this reading, her marginalization reveals the system's fear of transformation. These competing narratives do not cancel each other out. They coexist, amplifying polarization within the audience itself. Supergirl becomes a mirror rather than a message. Viewers project their own anxieties and ideals onto her figure. Those invested in stability read her actions as threat. Those attuned to displacement read them as recognition. The character functions as a site of symbolic struggle rather than resolution. This dynamic reflects a broader cultural pattern. Supergirl's story emerges within a media environment saturated with legacy figures, inherited myths, and entrenched icons. New identities are often introduced not as origins, but as variations. The expectation is not reinvention, but maintenance. Difference is welcomed only insofar as it does not disrupt the established center. Supergirl's refusal to fully perform that maintenance exposes the fragility beneath this arrangement. Her presence reveals how deeply modern mythologies rely on repetition to sustain authority. When repetition falters, anxiety surfaces. The culture responds by tightening interpretive boundaries. Ambiguity is pathologized. Dissent is individualized. The symbolic economy of heroism plays a crucial role here. Heroes are not merely protectors. They are vessels for collective aspiration. They embody values the culture wishes to see affirmed. When a hero complicates those values rather than confirming them, the audience experiences dissonance. Supergirl's narrative generates precisely this effect. She embodies power that does not resolve cleanly into reassurance. Her relationship to Superman intensifies this effect. He functions as a stabilized symbol of moral clarity. His myth reassures by appearing timeless and universally legible. Supergirl, by contrast, introduces temporality, memory, loss, discontinuity. She reminds the culture that its values are not eternal truths, but historical constructions shaped by circumstance. This contrast activates deeper symbolic tensions. Superman represents the fantasy of seamless integration. Supergirl represents the reality of arrival after catastrophe. One confirms the possibility of belonging without rupture. The other carries the evidence that belonging often requires forgetting. The culture must choose which narrative it prefers to amplify. The choice is rarely conscious. It manifests through emphasis and omission. Supergirl's moments of clarity receive less amplification than moments of instability. Her ethical complexity is flattened into emotional volatility. The symbolic spotlight shifts accordingly. The shadow grows not because she darkens, but because the light is redirected. This process reflects how modern cultures manage uncomfortable truths. Rather than confronting structural contradictions, they locate discomfort in individuals. Supergirl becomes a container for unresolved tensions around authority, legacy, and change. By framing her as problematic, the system absolves itself of introspection. The audience participates in this dynamic through identification and disidentification. Some viewers see themselves in her displacement. Others defend the stability she appears to threaten. The character becomes a proxy for debates that extend far beyond the narrative world. Questions of who gets to define meaning, who inherits power, who bears the cost of continuity. In this sense, Supergirl functions as a contemporary mythic figure not because she resolves conflict, but because she sustains it. Her story does not offer catharsis. It offers exposure. It reveals how cultures negotiate difference when difference emerges within the heart of their most sacred symbols. The symbolic terrain expands further when considering gendered expectations. Supergirl is not only navigating legacy, but embodiment. Her emotional expressiveness is scrutinized differently. Her anger is read through a different lens. Traits celebrated in other figures become liabilities in her. The culture's unspoken assumptions surface through this differential treatment. Her displacement thus carries multiple layers of meaning. It speaks to the difficulty of inheriting power without inheriting authorship. It speaks to the cost of carrying memory in systems built on forgetting. It speaks to the limits of inclusion when inclusion demands assimilation rather than transformation. The narrative does not resolve these tensions. It amplifies them. Supergirl's symbolic role becomes that of a fault line. She marks where pressure accumulates, where the ground appears stable until it suddenly is not. The culture feels this instability, even as it resists acknowledging its source. As a result, her presence lingers. Even when she is pushed to the margins of the story, the questions she embodies remain active. The system continues to operate, but its coherence is subtly compromised. The audience has seen the seams. The myth no longer feels seamless. This is the true cultural impact of Supergirl's conflict. It does not dismantle the structure outright. It introduces awareness. Awareness that stability is maintained through exclusion, that legacy is preserved through silence, that power often fears reflection more than opposition. Her story becomes a reference point for future narratives, a reminder that not all heroes are meant to stabilize. Some exist to reveal the cost of stability itself. The symbolic meaning does not fade. It circulates. It echoes. It waits. What remains is not closure, but imprint. The conflict has moved beyond character. It has entered the cultural bloodstream. The final movement will not seek resolution. It will examine what endures once the immediate narrative has settled, and what Supergirl leaves behind as a permanent psychological trace. When the immediate turbulence subsides, what remains of Supergirl's conflict is not an absence, but a residue. The system continues to function. The city still stands. The moral architecture appears intact. Yet something has shifted in ways that are difficult to reverse. The narrative moves forward, but it does so with a subtle alteration in its internal balance. A pressure point has been exposed, and though it has been covered over, it has not disappeared. Supergirl's legacy is not located in triumph or defeat. It exists in displacement. She occupies a space that cannot be fully reclaimed by the dominant myth, nor entirely erased by it. Her presence lingers as a reminder of a possibility that was not integrated. The system chose containment over expansion, stability over transformation. That choice carries consequences that unfold quietly over time. Within the fictional world, her story becomes reference rather than center. She is spoken of in qualified terms. Her actions are contextualized. Her difference is remembered selectively. This selective memory allows the system to preserve coherence while avoiding deeper reckoning. The narrative absorbs her as an exception, not as a catalyst. Yet exceptions accumulate. Each one weakens the illusion of universality. Supergirl herself emerges from this process altered, but not resolved. Her identity is no longer structured around approval or proximity to authority. She has crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. The clarity she gains is not comforting. It isolates her from the symbolic center, but it also frees her from its gravitational pull. She exists now at a distance that allows observation rather than participation. This distance reshapes her relationship to power. Power is no longer a means of validation. It becomes a tool governed by internal coherence rather than external recognition. Her actions no longer seek to stabilize a system that cannot hold her. They respond to immediate ethical demands, informed by memory rather than mythology. This orientation places her outside the dominant narrative, but not outside meaning. The system's response to her absence is telling. Without her tension, the structure appears smoother, but also more rigid. The flexibility she introduced, even unintentionally, is gone. Authority circulates within narrower channels. Dissent becomes easier to identify, and therefore easier to contain. The narrative regains clarity, but loses depth. Superman's position remains central, yet subtly altered. The presence that once defined the horizon now carries an unspoken counterpoint. His authority is intact, but it is no longer singular. Supergirl's departure has created a negative space that cannot be fully ignored. Her difference has marked the limits of his universality, even if those limits are rarely acknowledged. For the audience, Supergirl's legacy operates on a different register. She becomes a figure through which unresolved questions persist. Viewers return to her story not for answers, but for recognition. She articulates a tension many experience, but rarely see reflected in heroic narratives. The struggle to form identity within inherited structures. The cost of carrying memory in cultures built on repetition. The difficulty of claiming authorship without dismantling belonging. Her story resists closure because it mirrors lived experience. Few individuals resolve the conflict between selfhood and system definitively. Most navigate it imperfectly, negotiating space where possible, withdrawing when necessary. Supergirl's narrative offers no fantasy of synthesis. It offers fidelity to that ongoing negotiation. Over time, her figure accrues mythic density, not through grand gestures, but through persistence. She becomes emblematic of those who arrive late to a story already told, those who inherit institutions without inheriting voice, those whose differences are tolerated only until they begin to matter. Her legacy is not heroic in the traditional sense. It is diagnostic. The cultural imagination absorbs this diagnosis slowly. Future narratives echo her displacement, sometimes consciously, often not. Characters emerge who carry similar fractures. Stories begin to question the cost of legacy more openly. The ground shifts incrementally. Supergirl's influence is not explosive. It is cumulative. The conflict she embodies does not end because it cannot. Systems that rely on stability will always resist transformation from within. Figures like Supergirl will always appear at their edges, carrying memory, difference, and pressure. Some will be absorbed. Some will be excluded. The pattern repeats, but never identically. Her final position within the myth is therefore paradoxical. She is marginal, yet essential. Peripheral, yet illuminating. Her absence clarifies the center by revealing what it cannot contain. Her presence, when recalled, destabilizes complacency. She functions as a boundary marker, showing where identity begins to fracture under inherited weight. The narrative does not offer reconciliation, because reconciliation would falsify the insight it has produced. Supergirl's story affirms that not all conflicts are meant to be healed. Some are meant to be understood. Some are meant to persist as reminders of structural limits. In this sense, her legacy is one of permanence rather than resolution. The shadow she steps out of does not vanish. It remains cast across the terrain, altering perception for those who notice it. Identity built in someone else's shadow never fully escapes that shape. But in recognizing the shadow, something else becomes possible. Not liberation, not harmony, but clarity. And clarity, once achieved, does not fade.